Okay, rendering stage. We'll definitely be using the mall stick. We want to avoid using the tools mostly for this stage. If we do, it's mainly for correcting the previous stages, not really refining things, because yeah, it's hard to sort of refine it into a finer state if you just use rough tools. So at this point we're using the kneaded eraser, very thin point to nudge things around, and then use a bunch of these sharp, hard charcoal sticks, the blue ones, the H ones, to refine this further. And as with, I suppose, the previous demos, well, all the drawing demos, I think I won't be pushing this, to an extreme finish. And that's mainly due to time constraints, because as an example, my school project, the charcoal, was the longest one. I worked on that for 11 weeks, pretty much like 6 days a week, and I don't know, like 6 hours a day or so. So it's an incredible amount of time for one project, and it's useful, let's say, because you're pushing yourself really to understand things at a much higher level. You're honing your eye, you're honing your dexterity and all that good stuff, honing your understanding of edges and form. And yeah, so it's worthwhile to use a lot of time when you're studying, but I suppose for me that's different. I already went through this phase, and I just want to show you how it's done, not necessarily like re-go through a school like I kind of am during this demo phase of the project. So all this is to say that I'm not gonna push this to the utmost, dot picked level of finish that I could. And I will just mainly demonstrate you the techniques. So first we want to tackle the rendering of the lights, and afterwards we tackle the darks. So basically everything that is touching the lights, all the shadow edges, all that stuff will be touched. All the edges that go into the background, those will be touched. And generally it's a good idea to render a little bit of the background or a little bit of the shadow that is next to the area you're rendering, so you don't have to go back there in the next stages. Well, next final stage, which would be the rendering of the darks. And basically we want to finish the internal information of the skull before we tackle anything around it. The very final thing will be, rendering the background in the table and all that sort of stuff. So let's get started. With charcoal, it's a good idea to start rendering from the top down, and also when you're starting the rendering phase, I recommend picking some kind of low-hanging fruit that you can find, so it's not really so it's not so difficult for yourself. And yeah, maybe start with something like the forehead area here, instead of just hopping right into some very textured, challenging bit like this, where there's transitions in every direction and texture and multiple shadows to work into. And yeah, so yeah, sort of warm up with a nice and easy area. So always when you're starting rendering, you pick an area that you want to be working on during that session. For me, I think I'll do a larger area, relatively large. So maybe I'll work, this area around here and try to get it as close to what I see on here as possible. And, within reason, of course. First, I'll just adjust the values a little bit. I'm just using the brush a little bit. As I said, I'm not going to be using this for rendering, but I'm using this to adjust the things from the previous stages, which I feel these things are a little bit on the dark side. We don't need to have them as dark. So already that sort of reduces the extreme contrast on this area a little bit and brings it a little bit closer. And then we'll just start finding things to remove and add with the hard charcoal stick and the kneaded eraser. And when rendering, we see these small, lines and dots that are formed by the charcoal on the surface, and then there's these gaps that are formed by the texture of the paper. Usually the gaps are lighter and you need to color those in with the charcoal stick, and the dots are on the surface where the charcoal is sticking, and you can pick those out, lighten them slightly with the eraser. And this is an area I'll just, slightly demonstrate this technique called dot picking. At least that's what it's referred to as by many. And it's basically just grabbing some of that excess charcoal on top. And then you find the sort of light area in between. slightly color that in. And doing this, you can start to see why this is such a slow way of working. You can get an extreme level of finish, like to the point where the paper texture is not visible. That's not really the goal of this project. I think it's a preference thing, you know, how far you want to push the sort of cleanness, the resolution of your finish. But just know, you know, it takes exponentially more time basically if you just push it very much. I think there's been people who worked on a single charcoal project for like a year in Angel Academy, where the paper texture in the entire image was just not visible, where the sort of three-dimensional form of the paper texture started becoming almost distracting because everything else was refined so finely. And I think that's not really the point here. The point is to make the subtle forms and shifts visible. That's all you need to do. Texture is a part of the medium of charcoal, I think. So we want to make the transitions soft. You can go a little bit into the bedbug line, just sort of refine things. There isn't a very strong bedbug line over here, so, but we do want to have some semblance of that, I think, for the three-dimensional form. So I'm just going to try to mostly work this drawing by hatching, not dot picking, but I will definitely go in there and refine things wherever necessary so I can get the effect I want. Still feeling the bedbug line is a bit dark, so I just went ahead and picked out some stuff from there. Now this first sort of session of the rendering, I'm just talking a bit more, so you can sort of get a grasp of what I'm thinking about when I'm doing this. And then I suppose a bit later on I'll just shut up so I can speed up the footage and you'll see the entire process without mind-numbing boredom. What I'm looking for here is this transition from the shadow to the light basically over here, and also maintaining this lighter plane over here. I think a good way to address every situation, you know, is it being drawing or painting, is first you look at the shape you're trying to achieve, this one of the brow area, and you look at the shape. Is the shape correct? If it's not, then fix that. In drawing, you can first fix the shape and then move to the next step. So we nudge the shape a little bit. It's not perfect, but I suppose it's correct enough for the demo. Next, you ask, is it the right value? This is basically what you should be already asking yourself during the planes of light stage. But when rendering, we're always going through the sort of double checklist to further refine the drawing. So is it the right shape? Okay, it's looking like the right shape. Is it the right value? Maybe we're looking at this plane right here. I think it's reading as the correct value. There's, you know, the correct amount of contrast, I feel like. If anything, we could slightly darker this to emphasize the form. Let's do that. And after we establish these two things, we can ask what are the transitions and how do they look, you know, on our drawing. So this plane, of course, it's sort of transitioning into every direction. It's going downward, it's going left into the shadow, it's going up into the forehead where there's this darker plane, and it's going to the right, and of course everything in between. So we just need to start somewhere. Maybe we can look at the bottom edge. I think the softness or firmness of this shadow edge feels more or less right. Doesn't look distracting. Maybe what is distracting is this darker sort of tone that is going in a linear shape over here, and it sort of distracts us a little bit from the impression we're getting. Okay, maybe we need to actually push this shape a little bit higher up as well. We can sort of work the transition into the darker tone above as well. And I think this transition over here needs to be a little bit more subtle. It's feeling a bit abrupt. So we can just soften a little bit while lightening the turning tone. And it's looking pretty good. Then we can ask, how is it transitioning to this area over here? This plane is the lightest, this is darker, and should basically go darker with the logic of the form turning. So we have this lighter sort of squiggly marked area over here. We can just work that in. Now this is the lightest, this is the next lightest, and it's turning downwards to the shadow. Can also darken slightly towards the bottom. So maybe this area we could call done now. I'm not going to push it much further than that. You could always pick out anything that stands out, in terms of tone. If I go down that path, I'll just have to work the whole drawing that way. Otherwise, we'll have an area that's high resolution and lower resolution, more grainy areas. So let's try to move along. I felt the transition was a bit too harsh because of a sort of black line going along the terminator there. We don't really see any kind of line going there because of the secondary light source that I was saying is happening in this image, partly due to a misjudgment by me. I wasn't really accounting for that fact when I was just briefly visiting my friend's studio and decided to capitalize and take some pictures. So ideally you would only have one light source for this. So if you're setting up, just please do that, and I'll have a video for setting up a single light source site size setup up maybe during this stage or the next one. I haven't decided yet. Maybe the next one, the monochrome still life sort of thing, or monochrome cast equivalent, I might work from life actually to demonstrate that. That is if I can find out a way to sort of film my setup, film my palette and all that good stuff. So we'll hope I can find a way to make it work. As we're working on this light area, the forehead, we of course want to also check the linear drawing, not just the shapes of the forms and planes. This is a place where you probably need to just nudge the drawing slightly. What we'll also try to achieve here is a soft sort of transition. In general, a good rule of thumb is that the direct light facing plane will be the sharpest appearing, whereas anything turning away from the light source will also appear a bit softer. So we can just use that logic. This area is already appearing a little bit soft because there's less contrast between the shadow and the background, but this sort of light facing area will have to work separately to make it appear softer. But yeah, the first thing again with this is just find the actual drawing first, and then you can manipulate that edge to your liking. So maybe here we can have a quite sharp edge already. Now there's a distinct difference between this and this. We don't need to have these like razor sharp or anything like that, but just want to have something that is different. Also, anything that looks angular probably needs to be rounded off a little bit. And of course, mainly because it's not angular. Things just tend to appear, more angled or pointy, let's say, when you're blocking things in and refining from there. So I think at this point, anything that appears like a corner of the skull, I think should be rounded off. I just kind of hopped into this contour, even though we're actually rendering over here, because I feel like it's pretty easy to work at this point. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sharpen this area a little bit. I'll let it fall off, in sharpness again towards the bottom edge where the form is turning away. But yeah, maybe this area is the one I wanted to work on a little bit now. And yeah, curves like this are pretty difficult to actually just nail down perfectly. Takes a lot of time and nudging and of course measuring at the start, which I didn't do a lot of, but I think that's good enough. It's looking like a skull. It's not perfect. It's not matching that exactly. Maybe this could be a little bit flatter. coming to a sort of point over here, so maybe we can just address that slightly, but yeah, let's leave it at that for now. We always want to address drawing issues kind of first before we move into the refinement of those things, because naturally if you refine it first and then have to move things around, it's not going to be very efficient. So I see this sort of darker forehead plane kind of come down. Whenever you feel like you lose the sort of sharp point of the charcoal so that you can't really reach those gaps in the texture of the paper very well, then I think it's time to change the charcoal stick. Said I'm not gonna dot pick too much, but it's still gonna be a little bit necessary in places in order to achieve the kind of finish we want. I think we're lacking a bit of the tone over here, so I'll just hatch in what we're missing. So I think I want to just address this area and the surrounding area over here before we hop into, you know, addressing the texture over here. That's something we probably want to go over as well. Maybe here, since we have to tone things in a little bit, we can just slightly soften things with the brush or the stump. Sorry, not the stump, but the sponge end of this tool. Again, this is not very precise, so we might do more harm than good sometimes, but we also want to sort of address this shape over here. It actually comes a bit further. It's sort of consisting of the texture over here. There was this shadow area basically over here that I simplified. It's a bit smaller, and then there's a darker shape sort of consisting of a lot of texture, which we want to of course put in. So putting in this stuff also helps us address the character of this area a little bit more, and helps us also judge these shapes a little bit better. So it's fine to, you know, sort of revert back a stage or two, you know, sometimes it's just necessary. You just can't find everything during those stages, and I mean there's practically an infinite amount of planes and information in this kind of simple image. Just have to make some decisions and get the information in place. Sometimes it's not perfectly accurate. Sometimes it is very accurate, and then you can be happy and enjoy that result. But more often than not, this entire process is about self-correction. So I think we need to also darken this. All right, let's find some of that texture. Basically, the texture is formed by very small, you know, light planes and sort of adjacent darker shadow planes that are caused by that bit of texture sort of being elevated from the surface. So effectively you can create the illusion of texture quite simply. Just look, there's a lot of this linear stuff happening over here. Also goes into this sort of darker area. And then basically we just slightly darken underneath these lighter texture areas. You can also just use the randomly formed lighter patches that we have here to have them appear as texture. Already that little bit is looking a little bit more like it has some texture to it. You can also place some smaller, darker, you know, shapes inside the shadows to sort of create texture in there, but generally we want to be a little bit careful about putting a lot of texture in the shadows. It might sort of appear distracting a little bit as well. You don't really need a lot of this to sort of have it convey as let's say intentional texture already. Basically sort of imagining there's these little bumps and valleys and just creating the shadows for those bumps and maybe pulling out some of those with the eraser as well. And these things don't always sort of follow the primary form that is turning, which would be this sort of brow area turning into the eye socket. So they, you know, might go a little bit into the shadows, into the dark halftones, pull lighter things into those. That also creates the sort of randomness of it because it's breaking the design a little bit. Maybe what we want to be careful of though is just having things too linear, you know, going straight across like this. Doesn't feel very organic like that, so maybe we can just darken some of the lighter portions there and lighten some of the darker portions so that there's a little bit more randomness there. So this is effectively where like crafting texture is intentional. It's not like brushing the stick, you know, horizontally across and leaving a lot of the paper texture showing. That sort of appears, I want to say like more like unclean rather than, you know, designed. And this is an area where we'll really be working on that. This is just a quick sort of demonstration. All right, so we'll take a break now and we'll keep working on this forehead area. It's not a very simple area in terms of like this area, for example, it has a lot of subtle nuance, I think. And we need to navigate that carefully so that everything is sort of turning towards the light source. All right, let's keep going on. So I think at this point, this area we want to tackle is it's a bit complex, but it's easy to simplify these kind of things by turning these into simple shapes. So I can see that there's a pretty distinct like plane over here, turns over to an intermediate plane and then turns over into this light plane. Let's just make sure we get that first plane we addressed dark enough over here. And maybe we can go in and refine this tone a little bit. I don't mind a little bit of texture on this drawing, so hatching in quickly like that is fine for me. You can always just clean it up a little bit by going into these smaller light shapes and just refining a little bit. When working like this, it's important to squint. Squinting helps sort of get rid of all the texture and all the distracting stuff and just see the average value of the area. So as I was just saying, I sort of try to do the shape value transition process with all these areas. So I'm basically just working on the value right now. Just trying to really match that correcting. Ideally, you would want all this stuff to be done already in the planes of light, but these are also some very subtle things that are happening here. So actually it might be a bit tricky to get this level of refinement using the brush as a tool to apply the charcoal. I think then we want to see, you know, where do these darker planes, talking about this light plane and this light plane, where do they really like sort of end? I think they end around this, well, just go one plane at a time. So I think this lower light plane sort of ends up around here. I can just create a tone for that. I think this plane we could actually just try to put in with the brush, grabbing a little bit of charcoal that's left over from sharpening. I want to make it fairly subtle, but do still need to be applying a little bit of tone. This is more to do with the shape thing now. So with the eraser I can push and pull these shapes a little bit, so I'm using a sort of soft wide point for the eraser and sort of lightly pulling away some of the charcoal on the top. This is more about sort of addressing the transition. So we can sometimes sort of end up with too aggressive transitions. I want to say if we go with the planes approach, sometimes we need to take a little bit of the tone off the edge, as well as add a little bit to the lighter side of things in order to find the right transition. Using the eraser can leave a bit of a messy texture. You could apply the brush a little bit, but also that still is gonna probably retain some of that messiness. If you want, you can then dot pick a little bit to clean that up. It's not always necessary though. When dot picking, you sort of start to enter this focus mode where you're looking very, very much into the micro details, the small squigglies and the paper texture instead of the whole. So when you're doing that, you want to remember, to always, when you see those small things, you want to assess, do I want to lighten something or darken something to get the result I want in the, big picture. So instead of just cleaning up the texture for the texture's sake, you want to be like thinking if it's, something you need to do for the transition, or are you just cleaning it up? Because whenever you pull something out, it's going to make the average tone a little bit lighter, and whenever you add something, it's going to make the average tone a little bit darker. Now I'm sort of looking at this transition area over here. How is it turning into this lighter halftone shape? Sometimes rendering the darker stuff, you want to switch to the HP pencil, so you're actually leaving a bit more tone. So you don't have to scrub, eternally with the H charcoal. Especially for the darker halftones, this is very, very much a nice tool to have. Downside is, of course, the point wears out a lot quicker. So maybe we won't be going all the way into this area because it's sort of the most subtle area of the image, where it's like fully blown light area with some very subtle things. Maybe we want to warm up a bit more before we go into that area. So that's why I'm sort of shifting from here to here. I have to sort of think about this in a slightly strategic way, I want to say. Let's take a break. I also need to sharpen my charcoal sticks in order to keep going at it in an accurate fashion. Also, taking breaks helps you check your mistakes. All right, let's continue. What you saw me working on previously a little bit was a bit of this eye socket area and some of the nose area, as well as that bit of the cheekbone stuff there. Generally, you want to just focus on one area at a time. When I come to a complex area like this, I'll just probably, well, what I was doing was I was kind of fixing the shape things I saw being wrong, and was sort of roughly correcting things and then refining a bit as I go. And some of the things I won't have to touch again. But yeah, you always want to fix things before you move to the sort of refinement stage of things. Otherwise, it's gonna be for naught. So I hope you'll notice as I'm working here, I'm trying pretty hard not to leave anything like razor sharp, with just a single tone and a sharp edge between this next tone. I'm always thinking of the sort of transition to the next tone. Even if it appears very sharp in many places, you'll still want to soften it. Even places like this where there's a pretty abrupt transition, there's always going to be a little bit of turning. I want to put that in there. That'll help enhance the sense of realism. One advantage of not leaving this paper white at the start is that I can now, selectively remove things and make them slightly lighter, like here, to make things pop and also help describe the form a little bit. You can see me here working on this area. And this comes back to finding the correct transitions. When you're working on stuff like this, you might easily, when you soften something, finding the right sort of transition tones and degree of softness of the transition, you'll definitely be pushing around the shapes. So I want to start off with the nice, correct shape, and then you can find the degree of softness. But we're not robots, we're human beings. Things shuffle around a little bit while we're working. That's part of the process. You want to check things and nudge things around accordingly when you work on stuff like this. With very soft transitions like this, there's a degree of dot picking that is kind of necessary in order to achieve the softness. But I'm also trying to focus on not getting too deep into the dot picking, as that will just be excessive for what I want for this piece. Like, I think this level of finish over here is, just fine for this project. It conveys the anatomy, and that's probably the main thing about this project. If we had picked, for example, that standing woman cast, we might have some more emphasis on making, those very soft, gentle transitions to depict the softness of the figure that is, of course, sculpted, but, we can use the grittiness of the paper basically sometimes to describe things, or rather the lack of that grit, making it smoother and softer. We can describe textures that way as well.